Welcome everybody. I'm about to declare this hypothetical space open. My name's Nick Rowley. I do a number of things to keep myself busy. I'm a professor at Sydney University, and in a former life I worked as an advisor to Tony Blair for 2 years on sustainability and climate change, and for about 9 years I worked at the centre of the New South Wales government, working with then Premier Bob Carr on similar subjects. And tonight is a little bit different, and that's why I'm here. I wanted to do this in a rather different way, and so did Alison. One standard approach, I suppose, would be we would have some very erudite minds who'd done some very important work, who would share that with you, and that would go for around about an hour. And people would talk for far longer than they'd been told to. And then I would at the end say, well, we've got about 5 minutes left. I think we've got time for 2 questions. We field those questions, and then we all shuffle off and go, well, that was okay. So this is a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical space. We're not talking about reality, but some of the things that I'll be describing in the narrative will bear some relationship to current dynamics, possibly here in Australia. And I want you to look at the next hour or so as something that's different. Hopefully it'll work, it might fail, but when you leave, you'll be able to say, well, at least that was different. At least Alison and Nick tried to do it in a different way. So please bear with us. So CACE, it's the new clean fuel of the future. It's a wonderful thing. But what I want to try and address through this hypothetical is, what do we do? What do we do if we're some of Australia's top scientists? What do we do if we work for the media? What do we do if we're the chief scientist? And hell, what do we do if we're the Prime Minister? When the environmental benefits versus the risks really aren't that clear.
Go back to school. Sorry, Nick.
Can I just state that this is purely hypothetical, and none of my opinions are those that belong to my institute, and I no way take any responsibility for them.
Plus one.
Indeed, we're in a hypothetical space, but who are these people in front of us? Well, I think that some of you in this room think you know some of these people. And some of these people might choose to be very much like they were in the non-hypothetical space, maybe earlier today. And some may choose to be very different to how they were earlier today. Maybe they'll behave as they normally would. One of them, certainly, I don't think has played the Prime Minister before. We have 3 scientists. We have Richard Thackway. Richard, for the purposes of the hypothetical, is merely someone who has done more work on land and how to manage land and this land than almost anyone else, which is sort of true, I think. We have Corey Bradshaw. Corey is probably well known to many. He has a very arresting website with a wonderful CV that includes cartoons. So for that very reason, I think we should like him. And we have Susan. And for the purposes of this hypothetical, Susan is someone who knows a lot about allergens. She knows a lot about those things that go through the air and the possible effects that they may have. And of course, I think she's close to that anyway. Janet, sorry. If I call someone Paul, you know I've got it wrong. Sorry, Janet.
Good one.
We now have
That's my name.
That was very subtle, Dan. That was very subtle, and I can see that, by making errors early, I've managed your expectations low. So I'll try and lift. Dan, we know that you're at the Australian Museum, but for tonight, you are the chief scientist.
Finally.
You are the person who is close to the centre. You are the Ian Chubb on the stage. You are the man who has to bridge all of the assessment with feeding it into those who take decisions about public policy.
I would call myself the head case.
Yep. That's good enough for me.
We already do, Dan.
Next, we have Sarah Phillips. Sarah was probably known to many of you in terms of the work that she does in her day job, which is work for ABC Environment Online. But for tonight, that is not who Sarah is. Sarah is a print journalist. She's a print journalist in a pretty new newspaper, a newspaper which is called New Australia. It's funded by a very rich Chinese industrialist, and it is somewhat sensationalist in the way in which it tends to treat complex issues. Sometimes Sarah goes home a little depressed at the job that she has, but she still feels that she is making the newspaper and the content of the newspaper somewhat better than it otherwise would be. But this is not Sarah Phillips representing the ABC, let me make that very clear, and it may indeed not be Sarah Phillips representing Sarah Phillips either. Last, and may I say someone with a great deal of sartorial elegance tonight,
Got dressed in Melbourne.
is Sue. Sue, for tonight, you are Prime Minister Ruddert. You are our second female Prime Minister, but you are the first Prime Minister to be dressed at an op shop. So here we have our protagonists, and I think they're up to the job. I don't know, but I think they are. It is early 2015, just next year. A new, low emissions, abundant and easily exploited source of energy has been discovered throughout Eastern Australia. CACE. It's clean, it's abundant, it's cheap, and it's readily exportable. We can give this to the world. As well as being able to be combusted to generate electricity using existing infrastructure, existing coal-fired power stations, it can be easily stored, put on trains, and sold to anybody who wants to buy it. The capacity for CACE to replace coal as the primary electricity source in Australia within 5 years is proven. But significant reserves are beneath existing conservation areas, on the fringes of Greater Sydney and beneath rich agricultural land in the Murray-Darling Basin. What do our protagonists think about this? Richard, you've done a lot of work on land. What's your immediate response to this amazing new technology?
I think that it's fantastic that the scientific community has established the quantum of the resource, and it's about time that we provided some sound advice to actually begin to utilise it.
Thanks, Richard. Sarah, do you think we've got a story here?
Hell yes. But my initial response to this energy source is lots of questions. Specifically, how come I've never heard of it before? Where has it been this whole time? What does it look like? What is its chemical structure? Like, how can it just be swapped out for coal? I have lots of questions.
These are all very sensible questions. Chief Scientist, has this been on your radar at all? What are the sort of things that you'd be asking about this?
There could be a Nobel Prize in this. And my feeling is the head scientist probably logically sits at the top of the pile if there are kudos to be gathered for this sort of thing. But I do have some questions as well. I had not heard much about this until a few weeks ago, so it seems to have come out of nowhere. Under nature reserves, that is an intriguing problem, and I'm wondering if my scientific colleagues have not yet told the whole story about their concerns.
Thanks, Dan. Corey, doing a lot of work out there. Ever heard of this before? What do you think of it?
Yeah, I got a whiff of it before.
Did you? Yeah. Have you got some money behind it?
No, I am not funded in any way by the CACE industry. I just have to make that abundantly clear. But my view is that it's been demonstrated that it is, by definition, that it is low emissions. And in my view, regardless of the possible minor detriment that it might have to the unanswered questions that we have to still look into scientifically, to me, it's a net benefit. And we don't have a choice. We don't have the time to consider alternatives.
So unless we embrace this full on and wholeheartedly, we're going to lose all the nature reserves anyway that we might undermine, or we will, not might. If we don't employ this right away, we're buggered anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Taking a purely empirical perspective.
Thanks. Janet, I don't want you to croak your neck and turn around and have a look at this image here, but these are large smokestacks. Previously, water vapour used to come out of that. And out of one of them, there was a fair amount of particulate matter as well. That's all gone. That won't be like that, apparently, under this technology. You still need the smokestacks, but essentially it's just putting nothing really into the air. That's got to be appealing.
Well, I would reserve some judgment on that until there'd been sufficient time for thorough and multiple health assessments.
We don't have time.
Well, if we're going to be killing people off with unidentified emissions, then we
Not
would
that
want
many.
to know. Not that
Not that many.
And what if it was one of your family members who happened to be affected by this? I would want to see some data around the health effects of the emissions, and before I would endorse such a radical change in policy.
Thanks, Janet. Dan.
Yeah, I think Dr. Bradshaw raised one of the key terms here maybe, and that's net benefits. We can easily claim net benefits, and that would be something which might be a cornerstone of sustainability, which is what we want, particularly in terms of energy. But there's also this other catchphrase out there, well-worn phrase, which is precautionary principle. And perhaps it's the case that even as we're assessing that there might be net benefits, and that's hard enough without all the science on the table, maybe we have to proceed really slowly because of this idea of the precautionary principle. And I wonder if the health aspects kind of raises the flag there.
You do sound like a Chief Scientist.
It's amazing what responsibility will do with someone's
So at
opinion.
this stage for me, it's very much a science story. I will be getting scientists to talk about the science of it, and other scientists to talk about the risks associated with it and things like the precautionary principle and stuff. So I think, this is going to be one of the biggest stories possibly ever. But at this early stage, it's very much a science story. It's a pointy-headed kind of nerdy story before it really takes off. And it will be very, very fast before the media jumps on it and immediately starts making it about mums and dads at home and what this is going to do to their electricity bills and their quality of life.
So you think this could be bigger than David Gingell having a punch-up with
yes.
James Packer? You think
Yeah.
it could be bigger than that?
The Herald Sun might not go with a 7-page spread
Yeah.
because there's not so many photos at this stage.
Not that
Okay.
many pages in it either.
Well, I just need to tell everybody that the Prime Minister's not around at the moment. She's a very, very busy Prime Minister at the moment. She's in Jakarta talking to the new Indonesian president, because we know there are presidential elections this July, so it will be the new president that you're going to see. Some of us want more information. Some of us want to know more about the story. Some of us are being quite analytical. Some of us are being quite pragmatic. Some of us are being very enthusiastic. Well, let's just see what happens as the narrative progresses. My goodness. Powerful forces are at play, and the environmental benefits of CACE could be internationally significant. This could be of international significance. And Nathan, charismatic Nathan, well-known former rugby league professional, war hero, turned gambling identity, turned mining magnate. He tends to like a mixed career, but avarice tends to be now very much at the centre of his purpose, although he also likes to put himself forward as someone who cares deeply about the future of the world, as many do. But Oz Minerals, his new mining interest, emerges as the major investor in the first CACE mining enterprise. With CACE being so very easy to extract, his proposal involves 20 small-scale mines, each employing less than 100 people, in select sites across New South Wales, where the resource is easiest and cheapest to exploit. I don't know how familiar you are with these places, but the wine-growing region of Hunter Valley, outer suburban Sydney, just northeast of Penrith, the Wollamai Wilderness in the Blue Mountains. It's a World Heritage Site. The southeast forests inland from Eden and beneath Stockton Bight, reviving an existing sand mining licence. His investment is predicated on a contract which is already negotiated with 4 regional governments in China. They've agreed to purchase 200 million tonnes of CACE over 20 years for use in their new, highly efficient, currently coal-fired power stations. This technology has the capacity to reduce China's carbon emissions. Corey, I can tell you're getting very excited. Has the capacity to reduce China's carbon emissions by more than 20% by 2020, greatly improving the probability that global warming can be kept beneath the vital 2-degree threshold. There's more. Domestically, Eraring Energy has agreed to replace coal with 100% CACE within 2 years. All of Sydney's electricity could be zero emissions by 2020. Oz Minerals has patented their CACE mining technology. Large trepannas are now replaced with highly sophisticated vacuum devices. Rich has been all over Lateline, Q&A, he's even been on the Ray Hadley program. And he wants to represent Oz Minerals and the Australian government at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting in Paris in December to reveal the mining technology and CACE as Australia's key contribution to tackling the global climate problem. Corey, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a no-brainer. I mean, compared to not just the emissions, if we think about the renewable, that's not me doing that, is it? No. If you think about the renewable revolution, yes, we've increased renewables by a massive amount. But actually, since 1960, the proportional renewable penetration has declined by over half, from 19% renewable in electricity generation in 1960 to less than 7% today. So yes, we have more renewables, we have no more PV panels, we have more hydroelectricity, and we have more wind power, certainly in my state, South Australia. That's their claim to fame. But we have smaller proportion of our total energy needs provided. Not to mention the fact that if you go and say, oh, well, we can cover the planet with PV panels or put in hydroelectric, today, right now, and over the next 20 years, there are over 150 major hydroelectric projects in the Amazon planned or under construction. That covers almost the entirety of the Amazon basin. Now, the road network alone to furnish these, because it's dependent on the waterway system, obviously, is going to cause massive fragmentation, biodiversity loss, and really not get at the heart of the emissions problem. In my view, this modularized, low emissions, tightly controlled and cheap and available, ready-to-go technology is going to save much more biodiversity than any renewable penetration long-term plan could ever even propose.
Richard, do you agree?
Absolutely. In the past, we used to have surgery, which was, if you had something wrong with your leg, you'd cut it off. Nowadays, we do pinhole surgery. And I'm imagining, not only imagining, but the technology's there for doing pinhole surgery, pinhole mining in national parks, pinhole mining in agricultural areas, pinhole areas in suburbs.
You have to have
And will the forest collapse after you suck out, 200 million tonnes worth of dirt through that pinhole?
No, the risk of subsidence, the risk of dealing with all the salty water that's likely to come out of these pinholes is a problem, but we're working on it as scientists. We have the technology.
And let's face it, I mean, if the Hunter sank, really, would we be losing that much? It's Hunter wine.
Dan, you,
Spoken like a South Australian.
Well,
Dan-
am I wrong?
Dan, as chief scientist, you've been watching Q&A. You've heard what Nathan has to say about this, and you've been speaking to a few of the scientists, not only on this panel, but across Australia. Do you think you should maybe raise this somewhere in the government? Do you think you should start knocking on a few doors and setting up a process?
Well, we definitely need the communication lines open. Look, I'm always happy when my scientists get excited. And I sometimes even read their blogs.
Actually, Ian
But
does.
some of the words that are tossed around, for example, the idea that we're finding this case in the easy places and supposedly the cheap places. Well, I mean, my scientists at CSIRO, the Commercial Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, say that if you're going to look at something in terms of cost, you have to have all the costs on the table. And I'm really worried about the local people. The people in those, here's one now, in fact, calling in.
Oh, sorry if that's disturbing you in any way. Oh, what's that? The patient's very ill? Uh-huh.
Uh-oh.
I'll just give them
Oh, no.
20 milligrams per mil IVIG and a bucket full of cyclophosphamide, yes? Oh, so there's
Janet,
there's,
Janet.
I'm sorry, I'm busy just talking to a patient.
You think to-
Oh, my God.
Yes. If there's no space for a bed in the hospital, just use the corridor. See ya.
So, Janet, who was on the phone there?
Oh, that was one of my registrars at one of the principal triage hospitals. Had a patient emergency. I'm sorry if that disturbed everybody.
Okay.
That sounds like news.
That's what I was thinking. What was the nature of this emergency?
Oh, just a medical emergency. I'm not sure you'd understand.
Try me. I do have a science degree.
Oh, but this is a medical emergency, and as a medico, obviously.
Yeah, there's not much
Perhaps
science
you
in
could explain
medicine.
it to the chief scientist then.
As I said, he's a scientist, and I'm a medico. So.
Something makes me think we might have to get back to what that call's about later on in the hypothetical. But before we do, Prime Minister Rudd, busy as you are,
Thought she wasn't here.
you do occasionally get media reports from your media unit on stories around the place. What's going on? Some of these stories about this Nathan Rich character. He's a powerful man. Any initial thoughts about whether this is something that need come across your radar?
Well, I'm obviously vitally interested in a key resource that Australia can turn into an asset for the nation, for building the nation. And I'm very interested that my chief scientist hasn't informed me of this.
Sarah,
That's a scoop.
any news in a character like Nathan? In this?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure Four Corners is working on an investigative profile of, what's his name? Nathan Rich, even as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
Chap like that. For starters, he's far too thin to be a real billionaire. That makes me suspicious.
But what do you want to know about him, and what more do you want to know about this technology?
I want to know about his business interests, all of his business interests, where his money comes from and where it goes. And I want to know why he's suddenly diversifying into mining when previously he was content to be a casino billionaire. I mean, obviously this seems like an excellent opportunity, one would think, and it might be a logical progression, but is there any more to the story that we don't know?
See. Doesn't that touch you? It's a sneezing baby.
It's a very cute little baby.
University of Queensland research is now showing that there is a 20-fold increase in asthma and other respiratory complications in children surrounding the CACE combustion test facility. Another paper reveals that although CACE vacuum mining technology is cheap, maybe even pinhole, and highly sophisticated, the vacuum action has a significant impact on the water table, potentially affecting the fertility of existing agricultural land. And the endangered pink and purple Pardalote's long understood sensitivity to air pollution means that BirdLife Australia, together with the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Wilderness Society, have started a high-profile campaign against any mining in conservation reserves to save this iconic Australian species. David Attenborough and Lady Gaga both appear in the Save the Pardalote television advertisement. And Al Gore, remember Al Gore? He's written an opinion piece in the New York Times heralding the CACE technology as an example of how Aussie ingenuity will unleash a cascade of new investment, making the country the low-carbon Saudi Arabia, with the Australian people saving the world. Prime Minister Ruddock was straight on the plane. She made a major speech at the United Nations General Assembly, heralding this Aussie breakthrough as the key to solving the global climate problem. Time is short. The Prime Minister returns and she requests a meeting with the Chief Scientist and Australia's best scientific minds. To provide the country's chief executive with the advice she needs. Dan, how are we going to get ready for that meeting?
Well, I'm going to prepare, I think, some good news and bad news, I think. The bad news is really that there's this kind of fundamental global, local conflict and so on, and that we have an information gap, and that this is not just transdisciplinary, this is trans-fat disciplinary. Perhaps the good news may be that if any country can solve the problem by bringing all these funny disciplines together that don't normally talk to each other, Australia could do it. So the Prime Minister has a chance to go down in history to solve a problem that seems unsolvable. So I'm going to try and sell it that way to her as a scientist. And after all, Lady Gaga reads all of my papers. I think she's on side already.
That's good.
There's a story there that Lady Gaga has a secret interest in science.
Janet.
Who can read?
Janet. Janet, you've done a lot of work in this area. You've looked at some of this data that's coming out in relation to the implications, the respiratory implications of being close to some of these facilities. Are you concerned? Or?
Oh yes, I do believe we should have some grave concerns, and I have reviewed the 2 papers that have been published so far, and whilst of course I have no concerns with the quality of the data from one of the group of 8 premier universities in Australia, UQ, I am a little concerned actually with the quality of the second paper, which I believe was published in the lower online journal of human toxicology. And I'm not sure, but in the declaration of interests and conflicts of interest, I think Oz Minerals may have been the funding party supporting that second paper, which showed originally that there was no health effects of CACE. So I think we need to be really quite concerned about the health implications. And in fact, not just the immediate effects of inducing allergic rhinitis and asthma from the particulates that do seem to be coming through those smoke chimneys, but also the accumulation of toxins in the trans fat deposits in our ever-increasing obese bodies.
That was beautifully well put. Sarah, are there any stories here? We've got Al Gore, we've got health implications, we're saving the world, we've got a Prime Minister who's been telling everybody that Australia is about to solve the global climate problem.
We've got every interest group under the sun banging down my door at this point in time, and I have got a lot of emails piling up in my inbox, and I'm not responding to them all sufficiently. We've got the ACF and David Attenborough and Lady Gaga campaigning against it. We've got the local residents groups in Penrith. We've got all of the bushwalking fraternity out there campaigning against the Wallamai wilderness. We've got health groups saying that we've got a problem here and there's something needs to be done. And then on the other hand, we've got business groups and industry groups saying there are jobs. There's at least, 20,000 jobs, I think, is the maths,
With the
coming out of this
export.
potentially. We've got the potential for Australia's reputation to be made on the world stage. We've got the Prime Minister in New York giving speeches to the UN. There is just so much action going on with this one particular story that it is dominating the headlines to the extent that people are actually turning the page and reading about other things.
Ah, interesting. Corey, are you still such an enthusiast?
Yeah, well, I mean, this whole nonsense about the precautionary principle, please, I mean, as if we've been following the precautionary principle with coal and oil. I mean, come on. I mean, precautionary principle is one thing, but we have a proven case of real emissions reductions. We've been tracking at the highest IPCC and beyond projections for the last 20 years. We are dedicated to at least 2 degrees. If we don't do something now, we're screwed. My daughter's life is screwed. So, I mean, let's face it, all these things are just minor inconveniences until we move on and embrace it. Yes, I'm sure that we'll be able to spend the next 50 years studying the effects, health and otherwise, but we have to implement it now. We don't have time.
No Hunter Valley wine on the table.
Oh, that's such a shame.
The water in the Murray is an absolute mess.
It already is.
Richard, any thoughts on some of this information coming out about the effects of what you previously described as the pinhole mining technique?
Well, we have one of the best geospatial data sets in the world. The world is envious of the data we've compiled. We have the ability to determine that the amount of sacrifice area you're talking about is really in terms of the whole of the East Coast where this grand resource occurs is less than 0.002% of the area, and the number of people who are going to be affected is less than 1,000.
I mean,
Shouldn't we be running some sort of social media campaign and offering them a lottery and we give them a place on the North Shore of Sydney to live?
Interesting. So, Prime Minister Ruddock, when you look through your media report in the morning, when you have your head of communications sitting in front of you and she tells you about what's going on out there on the Twitter sphere and what's happening in the great papers of record, such as the paper that Sarah writes for, and the Herald Sun and Commercial Talkback, your advisor's saying, look, this is like free-form jazz. This is like a cellar in New York circa 1972 with a lot of people in strange clothing playing some strange music. And I don't quite know what the tune is, but you've got to intervene. And you've got to sort this out because we've got to take some decisions because otherwise we're just going to be spectators and we can't be that. So, Prime Minister, are you going to call him in?
I'm going to, pardon me, clear my throat.
She stalls for time.
No, I'm going to call them all in, and because I understand that this is an absolutely rip-snorting opportunity for Australia, not only to fix its own energy needs, but to fix a lot of the problems that have been plaguing us with climate change already. And so I'm very interested to explore all those opportunities. And what I want to do is I want to do it in a way that sets Australia up very much for the long haul. So if we have this non-renewable but fabulous source of energy, I want to use it to build a set of assets that will take Australia well into the next millennium.
Is this magical deposit available in other countries, or does it only happen in these rare formations in Australia?
A very good question, Sarah. It's here, but the thing is that Nathan is so wise and Oz Minerals is such a wonderful company that is so brilliantly well run, and the patents to actually get the stuff out are his and his alone. So although one might be able to mine this in other places, so abundant is it here that you'd set your industry up on the east coast of Australia without a doubt. Dan, I'm going to ask you to convene this meeting in a moment, but before we do, are there any thoughts that you've got as you prepare to get your suit on? And
I'm an increasingly desperate man. I may have to call in the economists. Truthfully speaking, there seem to be some scientific disciplines that might be missing in trying to prepare to create, to give good advice to the Prime Minister, I think.
But Chief Scientist, you know, the Prime Minister's office is quite big, but when you've got her time is precious.
Yeah.
You can't have 10 voices in that room. You know you can only have 4. And your job is to get these scientists into that office in order to give her the advice which allows her to set a course and take a decision and stop that free-form jazz. Ah,
Oh, no.
it's the Prime Minister's office. I don't know who the man with the bicycle is. I think he works somewhere there, but he's certainly not the Prime Minister. Presumably,
He's the bin boy.
he's the post boy or something. I'm not sure what he's carrying.
I ride a mountain bike.
Much more hardcore.
I like that. I like a bit of product differentiation in my politics. So here we are. We're walking to the other side of that door. We're all ready. You've got half an hour of her time. Dan, you're going to have to lead this. What is it you want to get here? You've got a level of brilliance here that you can draw on. You've got people who've got minds the size of cantaloupes. But minds the size of cantaloupes can be quite loquacious, and we don't have the time for that. You need to lead this somewhat disparate group of scientists to a perspective. It's your job, Dan.
Wow. I wondered how it was that I became chief scientist.
And look,
Now I know.
I know that it was at the forefront of your mind and now it's a little bit more to the back of your mind, but don't forget that Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Okay, so you need to draw on this expertise.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see you maybe just relate to your colleagues a little bit in those moments before walking in
All
the
right.
door.
Can I do that right now?
Do that now, but when you walk, I'll come back to you before you walk through the door.
All right, good. Dr. Bradshaw's lengthy, eloquent speech persuaded me to abandon my really defensive, arbitrary throwing out of the idea of the precautionary principle. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
But there's a bigger principle out there, and that is that I think we've got to collectively acknowledge that it's all about trade-offs, it's all about true costs rather than these initial imaginary costs that we were looking at. And so I think as a group, we're going to have to speak as one voice and acknowledge that we've got this tension between global gains, which seem to be extreme in terms of biodiversity. If you're really saving the Amazon and so on, that's great. But we have not only job losses in Australia, we have the loss of our favorite nature reserves, possibly. The loss of suburbs. Wait, never interrupt the chief scientist. And so I think we're going to have to go in and say, put it up front, that in fact it's a problem that is going to be all about compromise, trade-offs. I mentioned the economists because they have to be in the room. We're probably going to have something like a trust fund in order for some of these global benefits to flow back to cover the job losses or the losses of nature reserves in Australia. And I think we could collectively go in and communicate that kind of message. So your thoughts on that, folks? Make it brief, though.
We can, at short order, you recall those comments I've made to you on many occasions, Dan, about our wonderful geospatial activities. We should be establishing a monitoring framework which is about people and the environment. We can monitor the number of the deaths, the pardalotes and the declining health of the people. But I can assure you the environment will be protected.
Wow.
Well, I think that we should still retain a certain element of caution here, and whilst there is a time pressure, obviously, to inform and make a decision, it's a shame that we would want, as scientists, to leave our dependence on an evidence base to inform that decision and to simply make a rushed, persuaded decision on the basis of, an overly vocal green, push. And realistically, I mean, we can't have those kinds of environmental issues just, taking a broad swipe of a reasonable, rational opinion and the effects that it may have on the Sauv Blanc supply from the Hunter Valley.
I'd forgotten that. Fair point.
Professor Chief Scientist, or can I just call you Chief? Chief, I don't think we should mention biodiversity at all. Let's face it. I don't think the Prime Minister is going to give a rat's pajamas about biodiversity.
Wow.
We need to stick to the economics, so the finances look good. On average, there'll be more jobs made than lost, and on average, over the long term, there'll be a better environmental net effect. So let's not even mention that word. First of all, I don't think she'll understand it. But second, it's not a highly valued. Obviously, with this current government, it's not highly valued.
Ouch. What institution are you representing, Dr. Rocha? I thought it was a biodiversity institution, and I think we may have to cut your funding.
There are means to the end.
Okay.
Now, we can get our biodiversity and have it too, but we shouldn't mention it.
So my immediate conclusion from that short meeting would be that there are fundamentally different worldviews, even when I get only 3 people in a room. I'm afraid to think what it would be like if I had 12 people in a room. So that's a bit scary.
Well, you need to make an executive decision.
Yeah, indeed. Or I may have to get more people in the room because I'm really worried about the 3 that I did talk to.
Dan,
Get new people.
The Prime Minister will never hear me say that.
Dan, it's worse, and it's a hard
worse.
job. It's a hard job, but
Oh my
somebody's
God.
got to do it. The meeting is at 3:30. It's 3:28, and you're in that ante-room, surrounded by the beautiful Australian hardwoods in the air-conditioned environment that
Cut
is
down from our forests.
indeed that is
Which are
Parliament
regrowing.
House. That is Parliament House.
Get to pulpit biodiversity.
And you look down at the newspaper, that fantastic newspaper of record, the New Australian, and the article that's written by Sarah
On the front page.
Of course.
Well done.
tells a story about a meeting that took place only a week ago, in which there are a whole lot of people in the Prime Minister's office. And Prime Minister Ruddott, who is such a civilised and very, very normal and, how can one say, deliberative and considered Prime Minister, was apparently heard to bang the table and shout, "Synthesise, goddammit, synthesise," because of the lack of clarity in the briefing. She wanted it synthesised. Got 15 seconds before she...
He's a scientist. He'll never be able
The
to
4
achieve
of you walk in. Sarah, I'm afraid you're still in Melbourne behind your desk.
Yeah, I was wondering where I was.
But the phone is running hot.
Would this be about the point at which, a story breaks on Twitter that the chief scientist is paid by Oz Minerals?
It's hard enough. It's hard enough. I'm being generous to the man.
Yeah.
The meeting begins.
Okay. Look, synthesize, that's a great word to use. And I think this is going to be your crowning glory in terms of showing how your government is capable of synthesis, because we're going to have to urgently pull together a task group. It's going to have to be across different disciplines here. We're pretty much not going to believe any one scientist on this, because I've got some absurdly saying what you and I know well, that biodiversity is the most important thing, as in our discussions, we've talked about that many times, and yet we have scientists trying to persuade me to ignore that, of all things. So I think what we're going to have to do is turn the problem into an opportunity and pick up on your word and make it your next campaign slogan if you are ever up for re-election. And I think synthesize will be it. And if this works out and we can get that kind of multidisciplinary group together, where the truth does not lie within the paper from any one person, but really somehow we reason this out, I think we've got a pathway. We've got to buy time, though, somehow, because I'm a little bit worried that this is really urgent, and I'm not used to that. I'm used to, in fact, taking a lot of time to write my paper and then submit it to a journal. So I'm a little bit out of my depth, Prime Minister. So what's your response to that?
Chief, the warmth of your relationship
We
with the
talk to each
Prime
other that
Minister
way.
is touching.
Yeah.
But your colleagues have flown in for this meeting. They don't even get to see the Prime
By the
Minister
way,
that often.
they're in the anteroom still. I forgot to say that. They make it into the big room. That didn't happen.
Prime Minister, if I may. Whoa. It is your legacy. For the rest of your life, you will be known as the person who saved the planet and made Australia rich at the same time. I don't think you have a choice.
However, your head will roll because all of the babies in the Hunter Valley have died of respiratory failure.
Richard?
Prime Minister, we are going to do a great, wondrous job for the world. We will be able to provide them food, energy. We will be world leaders, and you
Wine
will
from
be
South Australia.
you will be able to stand in the United Nations and take the glory.
Prime Minister Ruddert, I think that these people have done a reasonable job at synthesising a complex set of dynamics.
As a media representative, though, if you're going to go with synthesise as your slogan for the next election,
I can't even spell it.
Prime Minister Ruddert, what I'd like to hear from you is what you tell your chief scientists to go away and do. And then I would like to hear what it is you say publicly. What is it that's going to be in Sarah's newspaper tomorrow and in the following weeks of how you have taken control of this situation, of how you've asserted your leadership, and how you have set a course whereby all of the complexity will be fed in to allow a really clear outcome, which may well mean that we don't get this technology, may well mean that Nathan has to go and do a bit of pinhole drilling in southern China or somewhere else. Or it may mean that there are ways that some of the downsides of this technology can be managed. I don't know, but you need to set in train some sort of process, I think, and then you need to communicate it. But it's a hard job being a Prime Minister, so give it a go.
Yeah, it's as I believe someone has said before, it's not as easy as it looks. I would like to remind my staff that I am a mountain bike rider, and as the successor to the road bike rider, I have a very different view on life. And quite frankly, I'm a little disappointed at what I've received from my chief scientist. And because of our warm and genuinely fond relationship, I have no bones in telling him he needs to pull his finger out. Because...
rift between Prime Minister and Chief Scientist.
He's easily healed because I know that he's up to the challenge. We have this tremendous opportunity of this fabulous fuel source and in total agreement with the proponents for the mining of it. I think it needs to be rapidly, and let's use the word exploited. And what we need to do is we need to use it as a resource to create the assets, natural capital, human capital, social capital, that will take us on, and I am serious, into the next millennium. I wish to be known as the Prime Minister that got Australia onto a trajectory of sustainability, and I wish to have a team of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary scientists working together to chart that course. And my private view, and this won't be found by the media, but I believe that most of the Hunter Valley wines have already moved to Tasmania because of climate change, so I'm not terribly worried about the backlash from them. And with them, they've taken the thoroughbred industry and most of agriculture. So I'm not too frightened about some of those things, but I do want to see a team of people working on issues to make sure that any of these negative things that are going to affect us, like the health impacts, are properly resourced and looked at, and with them avoided. So this is an incredible natural resource that Australia's been endowed with, and we mustn't sell it too cheaply. What we must do is we must get as much value out of it for Australians and the world as we possibly can, and that's what I charge my chief scientist to do, and I trust that he's capable of stepping up to the challenge.
And what would you call this? A CACE audit commission? Something like that? Would that be a suitable name?
Sarah, help me.
Why are you looking at me?
You've got the headlines.
I'm like the
Give us the
headlines.
headline.
Management speak.
So, Prime Minister, would you want to make this public? Or would you simply give the Chief Scientist a job to go away and do it? And then once the report lands on your desk, it's then that you would want to make it public?
I would want to make absolutely public in the very short term that this is a resource that Australia will make available to the world for the benefit of Australians and the world, and that we will not be selling it cheaply. We'll be extracting full value for it.
Thanks. I think I should call the hypothetical to a close. And what I would like to do is just to go to each member of the panel and just ask them their reflections on having to go through a process like this and how they think it might relate to the task of synthesising complex scientific analysis and making it relevant for those who possibly don't have a detailed understanding of it and yet have to make decisions. I'd like to ask the question, a reflection from everybody up here, and then I'd like to throw it to you here in the audience here, but if Alison has any people out there in the virtual Twitter sphere or anywhere else, then we'll try and take some of those questions as well. But first, let me just start in the middle, with
Okay.
Janet. Your reflection.
Thanks. Before I jump out of character, I just wanted to add one last thing for the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister, that if they were able to fund adequately, say to maybe $1 billion to the University of Queensland Medical School, that we'd be able to mitigate some of those health risks and prevent, mesothelioma style litigation in years to come, and I think that would be good. Okay, that said, okay, now I'm going to be me. I thought it was quite striking how quickly we were willing to let go of an evidence base for this discussion, and we're willing to rely simply on an expert opinion on the basis of our eminent reputation, which is incredible that really important decisions seem to be made in that way. And what we've been discussing over the last few days is quite often there's not a good transfer of knowledge from scientists into policymakers, and there's a blockage in that transfer. But in this situation, when you're forced to make a decision, nobody seemed to care that there was no evidence base around it or that it was properly substantiated. And that's an alarming reflection of how policy can be decided upon.
Yeah. Corey?
Yeah, I actually wasn't too far out of character there. And I'd like to say, too, that CACE does, in fact, exist. It's known by another name. It's called uranium. And it's time that we thought more empirically about it, and we presented the case, especially with respect to its effects, potential on climate change and biodiversity. I'm of the firm opinion that if we don't embrace nuclear power generation, we will not get out of this mess. So they're all the same, similar sorts of caveats apply, but it is the only thing on the table that we have globally that we can make a difference. So this isn't too far off the mark. If you want more information, I'm happy to provide it.
Richard?
Yeah, I too wasn't too far off character. Rather than seeing it being uranium, I saw it as coal seam gas. And I found myself trying desperately to come up with almost slogans so that the vital key messages could be transferred through my chief scientist to the Prime Minister, and I found that pretty daunting. And I think from the perspective of ACES working groups, it's not quite the same league, but I think we should use the opportunity to communicate more effectively what our working groups are doing into the policy space, which I know is a pretty impenetrable little place to get into, but I think it's well worth doing, more than we have done. That's not a criticism, Alison, it's we can do better.
I mean, obviously this was a bit of fun, but just prior to my time working at Downing Street, the Prime Minister had to deal with a whole foot and mouth outbreak in which he was getting completely conflicting advice from the Department of Health and from the Department of Environment in terms of what he should do. And David King, Sir David King, who was the then chief scientist, was absolutely key in bringing all of that advice together and actually, as a scientist, questioning the extent to which it was simply I'm someone with positional authority and gravitas and therefore this is what I think we should, and actually going into the detail of how one could resolve the problem. And it was an enormously helpful role that the chief scientist played through that. If you can stomach all the other pages, you can just go to the pages that have got Sir David King in them in Tony Blair's autobiography. And he talks about how the chief scientist played that role of, yes, synthesising all of that advice and saying, this is what I advise you do, Prime Minister. So, as I say, it was a bit of fun, but there are examples of where problems need to be resolved and need to be resolved really quite quickly. And you do get people, even though they might have eminent numbers and letters behind their names, where it's actually...
It's opinion.
It's opinion, really, yeah. Dan?
Yeah, that character wasn't anything like me, but I greatly admired that character that I was playing. Look, I think this was really quite an appropriate little scenario. I've always been a bit of a fan of hypotheticals, and I think hypotheticals are incredibly appropriate to global change societal problems.
Yeah.
That often they're going to play out that way, where we have a bit of a knowledge base, we're in the midst of looking at that evidence base, and then some new bit of information, some new surprises around the corner, and we have to deal with that on the run. So I think actually the way hypotheticals are structured is a good exercise.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to face that a lot. So those are my thoughts. I thought it worked pretty well.
Yeah, thanks,
and it
Dan.
did definitely call for synthesis, but I would not totally agree with you that would lead inevitably, even if we had a competent chief scientist, to the person saying, I'm going to walk through that door and make a decision.
Yeah.
I think the person doesn't have to be that brave. They may have to make themselves look foolish and say, it does have to be a task force because that's the best I can do when I walk in this room.
For sure, for sure.
Did your feelings about your role change as the scenario went forward? Like you were really, puffed up and happy to be the chief scientist and,
It seemed that way,
And
but
then
really
the-
I didn't trust you guys from the outside.
But then the weight of responsibility might have landed on your shoulders.
Yeah, it's a good point, though. I think you could see that happening. Yeah, it's good news. The chief scientist wants the credit, is looking at the new funding opportunities, and then is hiding under his desk or her desk, as the case may be.
Sarah, media tends to simplify, and these are complex questions.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was just getting to the point where it was starting to get more interesting because the Prime Minister, having made the decision that we were going to go forward with this new technology, you're then faced with the prospect of explaining all of the science behind the technology to an adoring public, and also all the potential downsides, the health downsides, and the fact that the biodiversity sellout professor has said stuff that are pink and purple partalute. So at that point, where you have that sort of conflict between the science and the willingness of the Prime Minister to go forward, and that's when the communication of those ideas becomes really important. And so it was just at the launching part of where I think it would have all got more fun.
And Sue, I mean, as a Prime Minister, you've got to choose your enemies. And you probably have enemies you potentially have enemies in Lady Gaga and David Attenborough.
And interesting too, that the Prime Minister wasn't worried about the marginal seats in Western Sydney.
That's right. Well, I was going to
surprised
relocate
that
them to
you-
Tasmania.
She was obviously in a clear majority though.
So Sue, just some quick reflections from you and then I'll go to the audience.
I found it really fascinating how quickly the science body came down in favour of using the energy. I had expected a little more argumentation on the
Yep.
green front, and I think it was also interesting to observe how the importance of having a synthesised message that can weigh up these things, but potentially going to a leader with that, knowing that that's what they need, that they need to balance the economics with the ecology and with the social capital and with some of those other things, and to even attempt to come to a Prime Minister without that net position in the short, medium, long term would seem to me to be a real oversight. And
Well, it's, I mean, in my experience, occasionally it's a bit like the West Wing and there are no papers in front of decision makers, but when you have organised meetings, it's actually incumbent upon you to synthesise on paper all of the evidence and then produce a piece of paper which gives the Prime Minister something that you believe she should say yes to. And you may not, and then the meeting becomes about the detail and how we can nuance it, and it's a working meeting. But you would do a lot of homework before a meeting like that, so that your job, although very hard, is easier. And that's why you should have really good staff around you as well, who can speak to all these people while you're off in Jakarta speaking to the next president. But people in the audience, any thoughts? Fellow with the beard, if you could just say your name and where you're from.
Ewan Ritchie, Deakin University. I think it's really interesting in how the scientists approach that, because one of the things scientists don't do very commonly is advocate. And in fact, we're often actively encouraged not to advocate. And yet, the other thing we didn't see as well is cabinet members as part of this discussion. And if you look at in Parliament, there's hardly a scientist among them. They're a dying breed, parliamentarians who actually have a science background. So my question is, as a community, if we want science to be actually engaged with more successfully, do we need to do a couple of things which actually encourage our undergraduates to get better skilled in politics and advocacy based on scientific evidence always? And can we get scientists into Parliament as well?
Related to that, and I will answer that question as best I can. First of all, I think this was somewhat contrived, not just the hypothetical, in that we assumed that people would actually give a shit about the environment, the people making the decisions, because clearly that's not the case. It's money, 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 and more money is what makes the decisions, and especially if the collateral damage is minor. So we had this, because of who we are and what we do in this venue, we were talking that these people actually give a shit about science, and even that subdiscipline of science called environmental science. That's not the case. Getting back to, yes, do we need science in politics? Absolutely. Why isn't there an evidence-based party of Australia? I don't know of any country in the world that has that. Perhaps that's a pie-in-the-sky thing. I don't know many scientists who would want to go into politics because you immediately have to sacrifice the thing that you are. But we can be advocates, and we can be evidence-based advocates, and there's nothing to suggest in the term advocacy that it's subjective or not evidence-based. We make it what we want it to be. And if more scientists stood up for what they know is right, and they didn't vacillate with probability theory, it would be a different political landscape.
Where scientists have ventured to go into the political space, they tend to be seen as prima donnas, or they seem to be stepping outside the discipline and not being faithful to the cause. And I think of some of my colleagues who sit in the Wentworth group. They've been incredibly influential, but my other colleagues who aren't involved in it think that they're almost traitors.
Just on the whole science and politics thing, I think it's a really interesting point. I think it was George Bernard Shaw that said the trouble with socialism was it eats into your evenings. Politics eats into your evenings too. So it's pretty hard to sort of ride two horses at the same time, as it were.
He wasn't drunk.
But an interesting reflection on why I think what you point to is important, and this is just me speaking, but when it came to her perspective on the climate problem, I think that it's pretty important to realise that Margaret Thatcher was a chemist, and a pretty good chemist, actually. She was at Cambridge University. And her chemistry meant nothing in terms of her understanding of the risks of climate change, but nonetheless, she was absolutely willing to bring scientists around her to help inform her decisions. And I do think that that's important.
But that's a long time ago, and there aren't many governments around the world that demonstrate that kind of philosophy now. I mean, especially in Australia, we don't even have a science minister. How anti-science can you get? We clearly don't value education, no matter what Christopher Pine says.
The fact that we've got an industry minister is interesting, because if you're a scientist who engages in translating something into an industrially usable product, again, you're often seen as being disloyal to the purity of science, because you're going to exploit it for a commercial gain, or you're going to facilitate that process, and therefore you're no longer a purist as a scientist. So putting the two together and thinking that one, replaces the other is quite ridiculous.
And yet, when I look at a list that CSIRO publishes of all the important achievements they've made, amongst them is Softly and Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword. We've got to demonstrate that science is relevant to society and relevant to our community if we're going to increase our value to the community. And yet you're seen as a scientist to lose your purity if you engage in those kinds of processes, and we don't have good mechanisms or tools to judge and value that kind of translation of science into the community.
But you could also say the same for arts as well. And I think arts people would make the same argument, that how do you quantify how well a ballet, what it actually contributes to society?
I guess you've got at least ticket sales, bums on seats.
But it doesn't necessarily sell well. It might be an artistic triumph, but it didn't sell well.
It might be artistically brilliant and unpopular, yeah.
There was a wonderful piece of work that was done that was a bit of social science research, which was actually questioning people's views of market mechanisms who attended opera. And they were all massive advocates of markets and free markets and neoclassical economics.
But have you seen the price of the tickets to the opera?
No, but this is the whole point, is that opera is one of the most subsidised forms of art. I mean, it's all just totally reliant on public money and some corporate money, but it's not about how much the tickets sell for. Anyway, let's not talk about opera. We've got a question from people who aren't even in the lovely Shine Dome, I think.
How do scientists gain the expertise today where dedicated research is under severe funding pressure?
Gain the expertise for advocacy or public discourse?
Just in general.
Just get...
Scientific expertise.
Well,
yeah, on your chosen topic.
Do it a lot.
Do it a lot, do it for nothing, do it for the love of it, do it for the heuristic value of it, and hope that someone will recognise its value and decide to continue to pay you.
I don't agree. I don't think you can stand around and wait for people to recognise it, because no one will. You have to go out there and promote it yourself.
True.
That's one of the things that I think scientists aren't all that good at, in terms of they're good at a particular narrow niche market where they're putting their product into a scientific arena. But when it comes down to, as we've been talking about in this meeting, is how to tell the story. There are many more people out there who are interested in a different version or a different perspective on that story. When I think scientists, we probably need better training in our undergraduate years to learn how to tell a story which necessarily will have a broader reach.
There's a follow-up question from the Twitter sphere, and then I'll go to someone here who I think had their hand up.
Another question is, where does community participation fit into the complex problems, and how do they get more involved in the science through things like community science?
Well, I'm going to say Dan rather than chief scientist, so Dan.
Visit your nearest natural history museum. Certainly. And I was required to say that at least once. So I think there is something to that where, in fact, we become storytellers and so on, certainly. And so the question was more about, like, was it more a question about how do we better communicate as it was
How does
phrased?
the community involve?
How does it, yeah, it was, okay. Yeah, okay, good, good. Yeah, actually, I don't have so much of an easy answer to that. I mean, we have expanding citizen science and so on. In terms of the kind of complicated sounding work that we presented from our working group at this meeting on phylogenetic diversity, which is a mouthful to say, we're also using that same method for giving bird banders credit about their life list. How much of the tree of life have they captured? So we're trying to convert complicated stories that are going on in terms of, say, conservation into things that involve the community a lot more. And I think that as a museum person, that is kind of part of our business. So that's my little answer to that.
Speaking as Sarah, I would say go visit abc.net.au/science.
Yeah.
There are so many opportunities for people to get engaged in science.
Start reading.
There are, and the thing is too, is that this whole idea of citizen science is a hugely growing area because people are realising whether it's using your computer in its spare time to be mapping the universe, which is a project, or using your computer in its spare time to do climate modelling, which is a project, or simply going out with your local land care group and, I don't know, watching to see how many magpies fly past a paddock on a given Wednesday. There's just opportunities abounding because scientists realise that here is a whole bunch of willing people who want to get involved and who are useful. And so it's really an area that's growing and being embraced.
Yeah, I can think of two more examples. Getting up in the really early morning at Moggle Creek and looking for platypuses and helping to track their territory. And another example is reporting the phenophases of different plants as another citizen science exercise in the US.
I can think of another one, which is people often like to take photos of their little journeys they go on, and there's a wonderful website that involves citizen science where people are able to visit a 1 kilometre grid square, it's a 1 degree grid square across the globe, and it's now being partitioned finer and finer, where people take a photograph to the north, the south, the east and the west, and they actually document what they see. And that's a publicly available website, which becomes a reference site for people who want to understand the change of that site through time.
Yeah, I mean, I think new technology helps in an amazing way. I mean, I'm a reasonably keen bird watcher. I won't call myself a twitcher or an ornithologist, but BirdLife Australia are doing wonderful things with shorebirds at the moment, and you can just find out about these little brown, very abundant things that take one hell of a journey every year, and they come back, and they leave their kids up there and don't bring them back, and the kids kind of get old enough, and the kids come by themselves. And they come all the way from the Arctic. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Anyway, sorry, that's just a self-indulgent thing to share.
Are you just fantasising about leaving your kids behind somewhere else?
No. I'm not appealed by this notion, no. Friend in the dark cap.
I had a question for the media, I think it is. Can
you just say your name and where you're from?
I'm Brian Fry from Griffith University. And I was listening to you and I wanted to add a public comment to your deliberations as a panel, and I was thinking, well, it's happening in New South Wales, and I've found out that it's koala droppings coming into the water table and interacting with some local minerals, and maybe so we should be quite. That's why it's in just Australia, and so we should synthesize this stuff in the lab, and they know these things, but they're protecting them because they want to get rich, this guy, Dr. Rich. And I wondered if, so you all conducted this as a kind of closed hypothetical without some of these more strange comments from the audience, but maybe that's what would you have said if you had a comment like that?
If I had a comment like the fact that there was koala droppings going.
That's right. That's why. So a scientist had said, there's a reason why Australia has this stuff in it.
Oh, I see.
It's koala droppings, and
Yeah.
we can make money out of this, and the patents will go to the government rather than this private individual, and this will be a big difference in how it's exploited and used around the world.
See, where the patents would go is probably not as exciting a story. The Fin Review might run that because that's more their sort of business angle. But in terms of koalas being the potential saviours of the world is like the best story ever because it's got fuzzy animals and it's got Australians saving the world.
But clearly it doesn't have evidence because there are plenty of koalas in South Australia and no case. Mind you, we don't have water either, so that might be
that's probably where you've gone wrong.
I think let's take one final question from the gentleman in the blue top.
Private consultant.
Yep.
Quite a few observations. I'll say three. You can turn them into a question if you like and respond. Observation that the chief scientist in reality has a problem communicating with the PM. From at least one of them, reports of that, and probably more than one. So that may be very much a hypothetical. Interested. No one was really asking questions and mobilising the evidence. I think you've mentioned that before, but asking questions from the chief scientist to the other scientists. The other scientists should be saying, well, we've asked that question, and Corey, I think, sort of synthesised it best, I think, but didn't quite identify the process you went through to get to that position. And the other one is relating it to land use planning processes. No one mentioned impact assessments. The Hunter Valley's got this, I forget what it's called, like high value farming land where you can't do mining and whatever. So, and those processes have all got public consultation involved. So how would that fit with the scenario, I guess is the question.
I was waiting for Nick to ask the question. I had a good response to it. But what I would have proposed there would have been a bioregional assessment involving the community and the natural capitals of social, cultural, economic, environmental.
You've got all the key words. You should be a politician.
Dan?
Yeah, actually almost the same comment, and I'm glad you raised the kind of regional planning thing because it seemed like it could have been an obvious little sub-theme that could have come out. And when we started to mention the term trade-offs and so on and net benefits and all that, that would have clearly been one pathway that could have been recommended in reality, because you don't have to mine it everywhere. So you're not just doing the cheapest place, you're actually doing a careful regional planning. And that probably gets you halfway there in terms of really looking at all of these seemingly conflicting factors.
Would it stay in one region? If to me the scenario was Australia and China burning this stuff, why wouldn't everyone else want it as well? And you dig up the rest of Australia to provide them as well.
To me, a lot of this seemed a little bit like, the home roof insulation. A really unthought through, rushed through decision because it sounded initially to be fantastic, but there wasn't time to consider it properly and use due process.
Alison.
Wait, there we go. Could I ask a final question about the hypothetical as a tool for thinking about how you would deal with problems? And I know Dan mentioned something about you enjoy the hypothetical. These days, we have people who, increasingly, scientists in particular, engage in modelling, scenario modelling. What if, let's put this cause and effect complex model together from the evidence. The chief scientist would ask his people to run a model. They would come back, they'd look at risk assessment using a model. From your experience as a panel, and I'm interested already in some of the comments, how do you think a hypothetical like this could be a tool that would complement complement modelling or is different from modelling and may add value?
Well, I don't think any of this that we were doing had anything to do with science. This is the tail end of the science application. There's no process going on here. There's no experimentation. We've done this, or we know enough about something, and we're presenting it. That's completely, people kept saying science is a thing, or suggesting it was a thing, or suggesting that it was a cause, I think was the term someone suggested. Science isn't a thing. It's a process. That's it. It's nothing more. So it can't be a cause. It can't be a thing. What we're doing is we're saying we use science to ask a question and get evidence to support or reject a particular hypothesis. Then we present it in a panel and discuss its implications. As a scientific tool, I think it's irrelevant. As a training mechanism for engaging with non-scientists, I think it's fantastic.
Anyone else want to comment? Dan?
Yeah, I love to disagree with what Corey says, and I think I do partly disagree with that. I mean, if we look at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, for example, it relied very, very heavily on scenarios analysis. I think it didn't push it far enough, and now the new Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is going to be really doing a more robust version of that. It means that that kind of scenarios analysis, which could be extended, to all kinds of hypotheticals, it's an open-ended kind of a thing, that is constructive because you're acknowledging uncertainties, you're looking at possible futures, and you're looking perhaps in a tentative way at the consequences of alternative decisions that you might make. And I think now more and more, because we're working at that rather complex, integrative global level, we're not doing the conventional science that I seem to hear about to my right, where it's a hypothesis and you test it and you have the evidence. It's a lot more dealing with scenarios analysis and uncertainty. And I think that process, in fact, is useful because that's what's going to promote synthesis and bringing these different disciplines together around the table. So that's
you
my
have to
take on it.
remember that I'm a scenario modeler. That's what I do.
Sue,
So am I.
Did you just want to have a Sue and then Richard, and then I'm going to say some thank yous, and then we're going to end. Sue.
Yeah, I would even take it further and say that I think hypothetical opportunities to engage in hypothetical activity are really, really valuable. We're in a complex world, we have to adapt, there is extreme uncertainty, and so actually the capability and the capacity for planning and learning and sorting these things out, that's what we have to build. And I think that being able to immerse yourself in a hypothetical or imaginary scenario so that you actually are thinking about this rather than too much arm's length is incredibly valuable to your capacity to make a decision when you need to make a decision.
And do you get value out of playing the Prime Minister for an hour?
Oh, I hope so.
Well, no, it's a serious question because, having to take yourself out of the science headspace and think like a Prime Minister with competing interests.
I really enjoyed it, and I, would like to have done a better job at it. But it really is, I think, an incredibly valuable experience to put yourself in another person's shoes, and really discover that it isn't as easy as it looks.
Richard, did you have some final?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think it works well with the idea of thinking about a group who have got expertise, but an audience who wants to be, in a sense, entertained.
Yeah.
But it also means that, Nick, your role is really crucial to try and elicit, but also get almost an unspoken relationship with the audience going.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you did well, and I really enjoy the idea of hypotheticals, and I think that there is a huge potential to make more out of them, and maybe this could be the new form of synthesis.
Alison and I are going to patent the idea. But I want to just end by saying thank you to all members of the panel, to Richard, to Corey, to Janet, to Dan, to Sarah, to Sue, for being such cards. And I want to thank everybody in the audience as well, because we're here in the Shine Dome at 8:05 in the evening, and some of you will have been in or around the Shine Dome since about 9 o'clock this morning. So I think you should get an award for sticking it out. And I also want to thank the woman coming with the mugs, being Alison, who I'm sure there'll be nice things said about Alison tomorrow, but I won't be here. And I just want to say that she's an absolute card, and she's a great person to work with, and I think everybody should appreciate her.
On behalf of the ACS family, we would like to thank our members who exposed themselves in such a way, which is extremely risky for evidence-based, pure scientists, which most of them are. There's one little exception who interprets madly, but the rest are very much pure-based scientists. And I'd like to thank them very much indeed for their time and their efforts, and of course especially to Nick. And I have to owe him one of his presents, won't be long, because everyone drank all the rest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know you might have two mugs. One might be more.
No, I don't have a mug. I'm excited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice to meet you.
Thank you.
There is more beer.
Oh, well then. Say no more.
I need a glass of wine after that.